The night wind carries whispers across the vast expanse of Lake Chad, where the waters stretch like a mirror reflecting countless stars. Here, where the Sahara meets the fertile savanna, where trade routes converge like rivers flowing toward a great sea, began one of Africa's most enduring kingdoms. I am old now, my joints stiff from decades in the saddle, my beard white as the salt we once carried across endless dunes. But when I close my eyes and listen to the gentle lapping of water against the shore, I can still hear the hoofbeats of our ancestors, the great horsemen who founded what would become the kingdom of Kanem. Let me tell you of the beginning, of the time when the world was younger and the lake was larger, when its waters stretched beyond the horizon and fish swam in schools so thick they darkened the shallows. This was 800 years after the birth of the prophet, peace be upon him, though we did not yet know his name. The people here worshipped the spirits of the water and the desert, made offerings to the ancestors who dwelt in the baobab trees, and sought guidance from the old gods who commanded the rains. The Saw people lived along these shores then, builders of great earthen walls and masters of ironworking. Their cities rose from the marshlands like islands, connected by narrow causeways that disappeared beneath the water during the flooding season. They were skilled fishermen and farmers, growing millet and sorghum in the rich soil that the lake's annual floods deposited across the land. But they were not horsemen. They had never learned to ride the wind across the desert's face, to read the stars as a map, to survive where water was scarce and the sun could kill. From the north came the Zaghawa, nomads who knew the secret pathways through the Sahara, who could find water where others saw only death. They rode small, hardy horses bred for endurance rather than speed, animals that could survive on thorns and bitter grass, that could travel for days without water. These were my ancestors, though the blood has been mixed many times since those distant days. They came not as conquerors but as traders, seeking the goods that could only be found in the lands beyond the desert. The meeting of these peoples was like the convergence of two great rivers, creating something new and powerful. The Zaghawa brought knowledge of the northern trade routes, connections to the Mediterranean world, and the military skills of the nomad. The Saw contributed their knowledge of the lake, their agricultural techniques, and their understanding of the seasonal rhythms that governed life in this borderland between desert and savanna. From this union arose the Kanem, the people of the south, those who would rule the vast territory around Lake Chad for 1,000 years. The first of our kings was Dugu, though some say his name was Sef, and the chronicles speak of him as if he were more legend than man. He is said to have descended from a great hunter who came from the east, from the lands where the Nile flows. But legends are like mirages in the desert. They shimmer with truth but vanish when you approach too closely. What matters is not whether Dugu was real, but that he represents the beginning of something greater than the sum of its parts. In those early days, the capital was established at Njimi, a city that rose from the sandy soil like a dream made manifest. It was not large by the standards of the great cities of the north, but it was perfectly suited to its environment. The buildings were constructed of sun-dried brick, their walls thick enough to keep out the desert heat during the day and hold warmth during the cool nights. The streets were narrow and winding, designed to provide shade and break the force of the sandstorms that sometimes swept across the land. The Palace of the Mai, as our kings were called, stood at the heart of Njimi, surrounded by a high wall that enclosed gardens where date palms provided shade and wells supplied fresh water. Here, the ruler held court, dispensing justice according to the ancient customs that had been passed down through generations. The Mai was not merely a political leader but a spiritual figure, believed to possess the power to communicate with the ancestors and to ensure the prosperity of the kingdom through his connection to the divine. The daily life of Njimi followed rhythms as old as the desert itself. Before dawn, when the air was still cool and the stars were beginning to fade, the drums would begin their ancient song, a sound that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. The people would emerge from their houses, the women carrying water jars to the wells, the men preparing for the day's work. Children would run through the streets, their laughter mixing with the calls of merchants and the lowing of cattle being driven to pasture. The markets of Njimi were places of wonder, where goods from across the known world could be found. Merchants from the north brought salt from the great mines of the Sahara, slabs of white crystal that were worth their weight in gold in the lands to the south. From the east came ostrich feathers, prized for their beauty and used to adorn the robes of nobles. The south provided ivory, taken from the great elephants that roamed the grasslands, and slaves captured in raids against neighboring peoples. But perhaps most important of all were the horses. The Kanem were already becoming renowned as horsemen, and their mounts were the foundation of their military power. These were not the great war horses of the north, but smaller, more agile animals perfectly adapted to desert warfare. They could travel vast distances on little water, could navigate the shifting sands with sure feet, and could carry their riders into battle with the speed of the wind itself. The horse was more than a mere animal to the Kanem. It was a partner, a companion, almost a spiritual guide. A warrior's relationship with his horse was sacred, bound by rituals and traditions that reached back to the earliest days of the kingdom. Young men would spend years learning to ride, not just to stay mounted but to become one with their animal, to think and move as a single entity. The greatest compliment that could be paid to a warrior was to say that he and his horse shared the same soul. I remember the first time I saw the great horse herds of Kanem, vast numbers of animals stretching across the grasslands like a living sea. They moved with a fluid grace that spoke of their desert heritage, their coats gleaming in the morning sun, their eyes alert and intelligent. The herdsmen who tended them were skilled beyond measure, able to identify individual animals from great distances, to predict their behavior, to heal their injuries with herbs and rituals passed down through generations. The breeding of horses was a science unto itself, with bloodlines carefully tracked and maintained. The best stallions were reserved for the royal stables, while mares of proven quality were treasured beyond measure. The birth of a foal was celebrated with ceremonies that invoked the protection of the ancestors and the blessing of the spirits. Young horses were trained with patience and skill, their natural instincts honed and directed until they became perfect partners for their human riders. The military organization of early Kanem was based on this mastery of horsemanship. The kingdom's armies were built around elite cavalry units, heavily armored horsemen who could strike with devastating effect and then disappear into the vastness of the desert. These warriors wore long coats of mail, carried tall lances, and rode with the confidence of men who had never known defeat. They were supported by lighter cavalry, mounted archers who could harass enemy forces and cut down fleeing infantry. The weapons of the Kanem were crafted with the same skill and attention to detail that characterized everything they did. Their swords were forged from the finest steel, obtained through trade with the northern kingdoms, and were renowned for their sharpness and durability. The lance was the primary weapon of the heavy cavalry, a long wooden shaft tipped with a steel point that could penetrate even the strongest armor. The bow was equally important, a composite weapon that could send arrows with deadly accuracy across considerable distances. But warfare was not the only concern of the early Kanem rulers. They understood that true power came not just from the ability to conquer but from the ability to govern effectively, to create prosperity for their people, and to maintain the delicate balance between the various groups that made up their kingdom. The early Mais were skilled diplomats as well as warriors, able to negotiate alliances and trade agreements that extended their influence far beyond their military reach. The court of Njimi was a place of elaborate ceremony and protocol, where every gesture had meaning and every word was carefully weighed. The Mai sat on a throne carved from a single piece of ebony, surrounded by counselors and officials who had spent years learning the intricate details of administration. The royal regalia included a crown of gold and precious stones, a scepter topped with the carved head of a horse, and robes of the finest cotton dyed with indigo and decorated with silver thread. The administrative system of early Kanem was based on a careful balance of centralized authority and local autonomy. The kingdom was divided into provinces, each governed by an appointed official who answered directly to the Mai. These governors were responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order, and ensuring that the trade routes remained open and safe. They were supported by a network of local chiefs who maintained their traditional authority while acknowledging the supremacy of the central government. The tax system was relatively simple but effective. Farmers paid a portion of their harvest, herders contributed animals, and merchants paid duties on goods passing through the kingdom. The Mai's treasury was also enriched by tribute from conquered peoples and by the profits from the royal monopoly on certain trade goods. This wealth was used to maintain the army, support the court, and fund public works that benefited the entire kingdom. One of the most important aspects of early Kanem governance was the system of justice. The Mai was the final arbiter of disputes, but much of the day-to-day administration of justice was handled by appointed judges who were well-versed in traditional law and custom. These judges traveled throughout the kingdom, holding court in markets and villages, settling disputes and punishing criminals. Their decisions were based on precedent, custom, and the guidance of the ancestors, and they were expected to be fair and impartial in their judgments. The religious life of the early Kanem was complex and multifaceted, incorporating elements from many different traditions. The original beliefs of the Saw people centered on the worship of nature spirits and ancestors, with particular reverence paid to the spirits of the lake and the desert. The Zaghawa brought their own religious practices, including the worship of a sky god and various lesser deities associated with horses and warfare. Over time, these different traditions blended and merged, creating a unique religious system that would persist even after the arrival of Islam. The most important religious ceremonies were those associated with the seasonal cycle of the lake. When the waters began to rise with the annual floods, the people would gather on the shores to make offerings to the water spirits and to ask for their protection during the coming year. The harvest festival was equally important, a time when the entire community came together to celebrate the bounty of the land and to honor the ancestors who had made it possible. The Mai played a crucial role in these religious observances, serving as the intermediary between the human and divine worlds. He was believed to possess special powers that allowed him to communicate with the ancestors and to ensure the prosperity of the kingdom. This religious authority was just as important as his political power, and it helped to legitimize his rule in the eyes of his subjects. The early Kanem also developed a sophisticated understanding of astronomy and mathematics, knowledge that was essential for navigation across the desert and for predicting the seasonal changes that governed agricultural life. The court astronomers were skilled in reading the movements of the stars and planets, and they used this knowledge to create calendars and to advise the Mai on the best times for military campaigns and trading expeditions. The education system of early Kanem was based primarily on oral tradition, with knowledge passed down from generation to generation through storytelling, song, and memorization. Young people learned their trade or profession by apprenticing with skilled masters, while the children of the nobility received more formal education in the arts of war, governance, and diplomacy. The griots, professional storytellers and musicians, played a crucial role in preserving and transmitting the history and culture of the kingdom. As the 9th century gave way to the 10th, the kingdom of Kanem was already beginning to show the characteristics that would define it for centuries to come. It was a state built on the mastery of desert travel and warfare, sustained by long-distance trade, and governed by a sophisticated administrative system that balanced central authority with local autonomy. The Sayfawa dynasty was firmly established, and the kingdom was beginning to expand beyond its original boundaries around Lake Chad. The people of Kanem had learned to thrive in one of the world's most challenging environments, turning the vast expanses of the Sahara from a barrier into a highway. They had created a unique culture that blended the best elements of nomadic and sedentary life, and they had developed military and political institutions that would prove remarkably durable. Most importantly, they had established themselves as the masters of the trans-Saharan trade, controlling the flow of goods between North Africa and the Sudan. The sound of horses' hooves echoes across the centuries, carrying with it the memory of a kingdom that would endure for more than 1,000 years. In the flickering light of the campfire, I can still see the faces of those early warriors and merchants, the builders of Njimi, the founders of a dynasty that would outlast empires. They sleep now beneath the shifting sands, but their legacy lives on in the stories we tell and the traditions we maintain. The kingdom of Kanem was born from the marriage of desert and lake, of nomad and farmer, of ancient wisdom and new possibilities. It was a beginning that would shape the destiny of Central Africa for generations to come. But change comes like the desert wind, sometimes gentle as a whisper, sometimes fierce as a sandstorm. As the 10th century drew to a close, new voices began to be heard in the markets of Njimi. New prayers echoed across the waters of Lake Chad. From the north came merchants who spoke of a prophet named Muhammad, peace be upon him, who had received revelations from the one true God. They brought with them not just goods to trade, but a new way of understanding the world, a new path to the divine. The first Muslims to reach Kanem were not conquerors but traders, men who had learned that commerce flourished best when conducted with honesty and justice. They were welcomed in Jimi not as foreign invaders but as valuable partners in the great network of trade that connected the known world. These merchants brought with them more than salt and dates and fine cloth. They brought stories of distant lands, of great cities where learning flourished, of a faith that promised equality before God and justice for all believers. I remember the old ones telling of Mai Hume, who ruled in those transitional years when the old ways began to give way to the new. He was a wise ruler, they said, who understood that a kingdom must adapt to survive, that rigid adherence to the past could lead to stagnation and decline. When the Muslim merchants first came to his court, he received them with honor, listening carefully to their words and observing their customs. He saw that they were men of principle, that their faith made them trustworthy partners in business and loyal friends in times of need. The conversion of Kanem to Islam was not a sudden transformation but a gradual process that unfolded over many generations. The first to embrace the new faith were often the merchants and traders who had the most contact with the Muslim world. They found in Islam a set of principles that aligned well with their commercial interests, a legal system that provided clear rules for contracts and disputes, and a network of believers that extended across the known world. Gradually, this new faith began to spread from the markets to the court, from the wealthy merchants to the common people. Mai Dunama I, who reigned in the early years of the 11th century, was among the first of our rulers to openly embrace Islam. The chroniclers say that his conversion was sincere and complete, that he not only accepted the faith for himself but began the process of transforming his kingdom into a Muslim state. He built the first mosque in Jimi, a simple structure of mud brick and wood that served as both a place of worship and a center of learning. He invited scholars from the north to come and teach, establishing schools where the Quran could be studied and the principles of Islamic law could be learned. The construction of that first mosque was a moment of profound significance, though perhaps not all who witnessed it understood its full implications. The building itself was modest, its walls rising no higher than those of the surrounding houses, its minaret a simple tower from which the call to prayer could be heard across the city. But it represented something far more important than its physical appearance might suggest. It was a symbol of Kanem's integration into the wider Islamic world, a declaration that this African kingdom was now part of the great community of believers that stretched from Spain to Central Asia. The daily rhythm of life in Jimi began to change as the new faith took root. 5 times each day, the call to prayer would echo across the city, summoning the faithful to turn their faces toward Mecca and bow in submission to Allah. The markets would fall silent as merchants and customers alike responded to the muezzin's call, their worldly concerns temporarily set aside in favor of spiritual obligations. The sight of hundreds of people kneeling in unison, their foreheads touching the ground in perfect synchronization, created a sense of unity and purpose that transcended tribal and ethnic boundaries. But Islam did not simply replace the old beliefs. Rather, it was grafted onto them, creating a unique synthesis that reflected the particular history and circumstances of Kanem. The spirits of the lake and the desert were not forgotten but were reinterpreted as servants of Allah, carrying out His will in the natural world. The ancestors were still honored, but now they were seen as righteous believers who had passed into the realm of the divine. The seasonal ceremonies continued, but they were now conducted according to Islamic principles, with prayers offered to Allah rather than to the traditional spirits. This religious synthesis was perhaps most evident in the institution of the Mai himself. The ruler of Kanem had always been seen as a semi-divine figure, an intermediary between the human and spiritual worlds. With the coming of Islam, this role was redefined but not abandoned. The Mai was now understood to be Allah's representative on earth, chosen by divine providence to govern the faithful and to ensure that Islamic law was properly observed. His authority was still absolute, but it was now grounded in Islamic principles rather than traditional beliefs. The court ceremonies of Jimi were transformed as Islamic elements were incorporated into ancient rituals. The Mai still sat on his ebony throne, still wore the traditional regalia of his office, but now the court sessions began with recitations from the Quran and the business of government was conducted according to Islamic law. The royal counselors were joined by Islamic scholars, Men learned in the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet, who advised the ruler on matters of religious law and proper conduct. The legal system of Kanem underwent a gradual transformation as Islamic law was integrated with traditional customs. The Qadi, Islamic judges trained in the interpretation of the Quran and the Hadith, were appointed to work alongside the traditional judges, creating a dual system that could handle both religious and secular matters. Criminal cases were now judged according to Islamic principles, while civil disputes might be handled according to local custom or Islamic law, depending on the circumstances and the preferences of the parties involved. The educational system of Kanem was perhaps the area most dramatically affected by the arrival of Islam. The establishment of Islamic schools, known as madrasas, created new opportunities for learning and intellectual development. These schools were not just centers of religious instruction, but places where students could learn to read and write Arabic, study mathematics and astronomy, and engage with the great works of Islamic scholarship. The curriculum was demanding, requiring students to memorize large portions of the Quran while also mastering the complex principles of Islamic jurisprudence. The first scholars to arrive in Kanem were men of great learning and devotion, missionaries who had traveled vast distances to spread the word of Islam. They established themselves in the cities and towns, building schools and libraries, translating important texts into local languages, and training local students to become teachers and judges. These scholars were not just religious figures but intellectuals who brought with them knowledge of medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and other sciences that had been developed in the Islamic world. The library that grew up around the great mosque of Njimi became a center of learning that attracted students from across the Sudan. Here, manuscripts were carefully copied and preserved, creating a repository of knowledge that would serve scholars for generations to come. The library contained not just religious texts but works on history, geography, medicine, and natural philosophy, creating a comprehensive collection that reflected the breadth of Islamic scholarship. The pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj, became an important element in the religious life of Kanem's elite. The journey across the desert and through the lands of Islam was not just a spiritual obligation but a diplomatic and commercial opportunity. The Mai and his nobles who undertook the pilgrimage returned with new ideas, new technologies, and new contacts that enriched their kingdom. The pilgrimage also served to demonstrate Kanem's commitment to Islam and its place within the wider community of believers. Mai Dunama is remembered as having been among the first of our rulers to make the pilgrimage to Mecca, a journey that took him across the breadth of the Islamic world. The chroniclers describe his caravan as a magnificent sight, with hundreds of camels loaded with gifts for the holy cities, accompanied by scholars, merchants, and warriors. The journey took months, passing through the kingdoms of the Nile Valley and the holy cities of the Hijaz, before finally reaching Mecca itself. The impact of this pilgrimage on Kanem was profound and lasting. The Mai returned with new ideas about governance and administration, new technologies for agriculture and warfare, and new contacts with rulers and merchants throughout the Islamic world. He brought back with him scholars and craftsmen who helped to further develop the kingdom's institutions and economy. Most importantly, he returned with a deeper understanding of Islam and a commitment to making his kingdom a truly Islamic state. The influence of Islam on Kanem's military organization was subtle but significant. The concept of jihad, holy war in defense of the faith, provided a religious justification for military campaigns and helped to motivate warriors who might otherwise have been fighting purely for material gain. The strict Islamic code of conduct in warfare, with its emphasis on mercy toward prisoners and protection of non-combatants, helped to moderate some of the harsher aspects of traditional warfare. The horse cavalry that had always been the backbone of Kanem's military power took on new significance in the context of Islamic warfare. The mounted warrior, armed with sword and lance, became a symbol of the faithful defender of Islam, the Ghazi who fought to extend the realm of the faithful. The traditional skills of horsemanship were now seen not just as military necessities, but as expressions of the warrior's devotion to God and his commitment to the defense of the faith. The economic impact of Islam on Kanem was equally significant. The kingdom's integration into the Islamic world opened new markets and created new opportunities for trade. The network of Muslim merchants that extended across North Africa and the Middle East provided Kanem with access to goods and markets that had previously been beyond its reach. The Islamic principles of fair dealing and honest commerce helped to create an atmosphere of trust that facilitated long-distance trade. The golden age of Kanem's power was built upon this foundation of faith and commerce, but it was the sword that extended the kingdom's boundaries and secured its dominance over the trade routes of the central Sudan. As the 12th century dawned, the Mais of Kanem began to look beyond the shores of Lake Chad, their eyes turning toward the rich lands that lay in all directions from their desert capital. The time of expansion had come, and with it would come glory and wealth beyond the dreams of the kingdom's founders. Mai Dunama Dabbalemi, who ruled during the 13th century, was perhaps the greatest of all our warrior kings. His name still echoes across the desert like thunder, and even now, centuries after his death, mothers speak of him to their children as the epitome of royal virtue and military prowess. Under his leadership, Kanem's armies rode out from Jimmy like a great wave, sweeping across the Sudan and carrying the banner of Islam to lands that had never known the faith. The heavy cavalry of Kanem had by this time evolved into a military machine of terrifying efficiency. The warriors wore armor of quilted cotton reinforced with metal plates, their bodies protected from head to toe against the weapons of their enemies. Their horses, bred for generations for strength and endurance, were similarly armored, their heads and necks protected by plates of iron and brass. The sight of these mounted warriors approaching across the desert was enough to strike terror into the hearts of their enemies, their lance points glinting in the sun like stars fallen to earth. The military campaigns of Dabbalemi were not mere raids for plunder, but systematic conquests designed to extend Kanem's control over the trade routes and to spread the faith of Islam. His armies moved with the precision of a well-orchestrated dance, the heavy cavalry striking at the heart of enemy formations, while lighter forces harassed the flanks and cut off retreat. The sound of thousands of hooves thundering across the hard-packed earth was like the approach of an earthquake, a force of nature that could not be stopped or turned aside. The conquest of the Fezzan, the great oasis region that lay to the north of Lake Chad, was perhaps Dabbalemi's greatest achievement. This strategic territory controlled the southern terminus of the trans-Saharan trade routes, and its capture gave Kanem direct access to the wealth of North Africa. The campaign was long and difficult, requiring the army to operate far from its base of supply, but the rewards were immense. The oases of the Fezzan provided not just strategic advantage but enormous wealth, their date palms and salt mines generating revenues that would fund further expansion. The siege of Tragan, the principal city of the Fezzan, demonstrated the sophistication of Kanem's military technology. The army brought with it engines of war that had been adapted from designs learned during the pilgrimage to Mecca, great catapults that could hurl stones with devastating effect against the city's walls. The defenders, unaccustomed to such weapons, found their fortifications inadequate against the relentless bombardment. After months of siege, the city fell, its gates thrown open by a population exhausted by hunger and fear. But Dabbalemi's conquests were not limited to the north. His armies also struck eastward into the region of Kawar, another vital link in the trans-Saharan trade network. The salt mines of Kawar were among the richest in the Sahara, their white crystal worth more than gold in the markets of the south. The conquest of this region not only provided Kanem with enormous wealth, but also gave it control over one of the most important trade goods in the African economy. The expansion southward into the lands of the Kitoko and other peoples of the Chad Basin was driven by different motives. These were fertile territories, rich in agricultural potential and populated by skilled craftsmen and farmers. The conquest of these lands provided Kanem with a broader economic base, reducing its dependence on trade and providing the agricultural surplus necessary to support its growing population and expanding military forces. The integration of conquered territories into the Kanem state was accomplished through a combination of military force and diplomatic skill. Local rulers who submitted peacefully were often allowed to retain their positions as vassals of the Mai, while those who resisted were replaced by governors appointed from among the Kanem nobility. The Islamic faith was gradually introduced to these new territories, often through the establishment of mosques and schools that served as centers of both religious and secular learning. The administrative system that governed this expanding empire was remarkably sophisticated for its time. The Mai remained the ultimate authority, but the day-to-day administration was carried out by a hierarchy of officials that extended from the royal court in Jimmy to the remotest provinces. Communication across this vast territory was maintained by a system of mounted messengers who could carry orders and reports across hundreds of miles of desert and savanna. The wealth that flowed into Kanem from its conquests and its control of the trade routes transformed the kingdom in ways that would have been unimaginable to its founders. The simple mud-brick buildings of early Jimmy gave way to structures of impressive size and decoration, their walls adorned with geometric patterns and Arabic inscriptions. The royal palace became a complex of buildings that rivaled the courts of the great Islamic kingdoms of the north, its audience halls capable of accommodating thousands of visitors and petitioners. The court of Dabbalemi was a center of learning and culture that attracted scholars and artists from across the Islamic world. The library of Jimmy grew to contain thousands of manuscripts, its collection rivaling those of Cairo and Baghdad. Scholars came from as far away as Spain and Central Asia to study and teach, bringing with them knowledge of medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy that enriched the intellectual life of the kingdom. The economic prosperity of this golden age was based not just on conquest and tribute, but on the systematic development of trade networks that connected Kanem to markets throughout the known world. The kingdom's merchants were skilled negotiators who understood the complexities of international commerce, and their caravans carried goods from the forests of the south to the cities of the Mediterranean. The profits from this trade funded not just military campaigns but also the construction of mosques, schools, and other public works that enhanced the kingdom's prestige and power. The trans-Saharan trade routes that passed through Kanem carried goods of extraordinary variety and value. From the north came horses, weapons, books, and manufactured goods, while the south provided gold, ivory, slaves, and exotic animals. The kingdom's position astride these routes gave it enormous leverage in negotiations with trading partners, and the taxes and duties collected from passing merchants provided a steady stream of revenue that supported the state's activities. The slave trade, though morally reprehensible by modern standards, was a central element of Kanem's economy during this period. The kingdom's military campaigns provided a steady supply of captives who were sold in the markets of North Africa and the Middle East. These slaves were highly prized for their strength and intelligence, and the profits from their sale funded further military expansion and the construction of public works. The cultural flowering that accompanied Kanem's political and economic expansion was equally remarkable. The kingdom's artisans developed distinctive styles of metalwork, pottery, and textile production that reflected both local traditions and influences from the wider Islamic world. The court patronized poets and musicians who created works that celebrated the kingdom's achievements and preserved its history for future generations. The religious life of Kanem during this period was characterized by a deepening commitment to Islamic orthodoxy combined with a continuing respect for local traditions. The kingdom's rulers were pious Muslims who supported the construction of mosques and the establishment of religious schools, but they also understood the importance of maintaining the loyalty of subjects who might not share their religious enthusiasm. The result was a form of Islam that was both orthodox and tolerant, strict in its adherence to basic principles but flexible in its application to local circumstances. The pilgrimage to Mecca became an increasingly important element of royal policy, serving not just as a religious obligation but as a diplomatic tool. The lavish gifts that the Mays brought to the holy cities impressed rulers and merchants throughout the Islamic world, while the contacts made during the journey provided valuable intelligence about political and economic conditions in distant lands. The pilgrimage also served to demonstrate Kanem's commitment to Islam and its place within the community of believers. The military innovations that emerged during this period of expansion reflected the kingdom's growing sophistication and its exposure to new technologies and tactics. The traditional cavalry remained the backbone of Kanem's armies, but it was now supplemented by units of archers, spearmen, and specialists in siege warfare. The kingdom's armories produced weapons of exceptional quality, their swords and spears rivaling those of the great military powers of the north. The fortifications that protected Kanem cities and trade routes were constantly improved and expanded, incorporating lessons learned from military campaigns and from contact with other civilizations. The walls of Njimi were strengthened and heightened, while new fortresses were built at strategic points throughout the kingdom. These defensive works were not just military installations but symbols of the kingdom's power and permanence. The diplomatic relations that Kanem maintained with other powers during this period were complex and far-reaching. The kingdom's ambassadors traveled to the courts of Egypt, Tunisia, and other Islamic states, negotiating treaties and trade agreements that enhanced its international standing. These diplomatic contacts provided not just political advantages, but also opportunities for cultural and intellectual exchange that enriched the kingdom's civilization. The reign of Mai Dunama Dabbalemi marked the pinnacle of Kanem's power and influence, but it also contained the seeds of future difficulties. The kingdom's rapid expansion had created an empire that was perhaps too large to be effectively governed from a single center, while the costs of maintaining such a vast territory placed enormous strains on the royal treasury. The very success of the kingdom's military campaigns had created new challenges that would test the wisdom and skill of future rulers. As the 13th century drew to a close, the great caravans still moved across the desert, their bells ringing in the night air like the voices of spirits. The warriors of Kanem still rode out from Jimmy, their lances bright with victory, their horses bred for speed and endurance. The call to prayer still echoed across the waters of Lake Chad, summoning the faithful to bow before Allah and to remember the greatness of their kingdom. But change was coming, as it always does, and with it would come new challenges that would test the strength and wisdom of the descendants of the great kings. The 14th century brought with it the winds of transformation that would reshape the very foundations of our kingdom. From the east came the Bilala people, fierce warriors who had learned well the lessons of desert warfare and who coveted the wealth and power that Kanem had accumulated over the centuries. Their raids grew bolder and more frequent, striking at the heart of our territory and threatening the very existence of the Sayfawa dynasty that had ruled for so long. The conflict with the Bilala was not a simple matter of one army meeting another on the field of battle. It was a struggle for the soul of the Chad Basin, a contest between two peoples who understood that only one could emerge victorious. The Bilala brought with them new tactics and new weapons, and their knowledge of the local terrain gave them advantages that our armies had not previously faced. The great cavalry charges that had served us so well in the past proved less effective against an enemy that knew how to use the landscape to their advantage. The pressure from the Bilala was relentless, and despite the valor of our warriors and the skill of our commanders, the kingdom found itself gradually pushed westward, away from the ancestral lands around Lake Chad. The great city of Njimi, which had stood as the symbol of our power for centuries, finally fell to the invaders, its walls breached and its palaces burned. The loss of the ancient capital was a blow that struck at the very heart of our identity, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in our history. The migration westward was not a headlong flight but a strategic withdrawal, carefully planned and executed by rulers who understood that survival sometimes requires the abandonment of what is familiar in favor of what is possible. The Mai and his court, accompanied by the most skilled craftsmen and the most learned scholars, established a new capital at Zaghawa, west of Lake Chad. This city, built on the ruins of earlier settlements, would become the heart of what we now call the Bornu Empire. The transformation from Kanem to Bornu was more than a simple change of location. It represented a fundamental shift in the nature of our kingdom, an adaptation to new circumstances that required new approaches to governance, warfare, and diplomacy. The Mais who ruled from Zaghawa understood that they could no longer rely solely on the traditional methods that had served their ancestors, and they began to experiment with new forms of organization and new sources of power. The establishment of Bornu as a distinct entity required the creation of new institutions and the modification of old ones. The administrative system that had governed the far-flung territories of Kanem was streamlined and centralized, with power concentrated in the hands of the Mai and his closest advisors. The military was reorganized along new lines, with greater emphasis placed on defensive capabilities and the protection of the kingdom's core territories. The new capital of Zaghawa was designed to reflect the changed circumstances of the kingdom. Unlike Njimi, which had been built gradually over centuries, Zaghawa was planned from the beginning as a fortified city capable of withstanding siege. Its walls were higher and thicker than those of the old capital, its gates more heavily defended, and its layout designed to facilitate the movement of troops and supplies during times of crisis. The court of Bornu maintained many of the traditions and ceremonies that had characterized the Old Kingdom, but they were adapted to fit the new reality. The Mai still sat on his throne of ebony, still wore the traditional regalia of his office, but the ceremonies now took place in new surroundings and were witnessed by new audiences. The scholars and artists who had fled from Jimmy found new patrons in Zaghawa, but their works now reflected themes of exile and renewal rather than simple triumph and conquest. The economic foundations of Bornu were necessarily different from those of Kanem. The kingdom's control over the trans-Saharan trade routes had been disrupted by the Bilala conquest, and new sources of revenue had to be found. The Mais of Bornu turned their attention to the development of agriculture and local industry, encouraging the cultivation of new crops and the establishment of craft workshops that could produce goods for both domestic consumption and export. The religious life of Bornu continued to be centered on Islam, but the experience of exile and displacement had given new meaning to the faith. The mosques of Zaghawa became not just places of worship but centers of community life, where the displaced populations could find comfort and solidarity. The scholars who had preserved the manuscripts and traditions of Kanem worked to ensure that the kingdom's intellectual heritage was not lost in the transition to new circumstances. The military challenges that faced Bornu were different from those that had confronted Kanem. The kingdom's armies were no longer primarily concerned with conquest and expansion but with defense and survival. The traditional heavy cavalry remained important, but new emphasis was placed on the development of fortifications and the training of infantry forces that could defend fixed positions. The arrival of firearms in the region during the 15th century marked another significant transformation in the nature of warfare. The Mais of Bornu were quick to recognize the potential of these new weapons, and they began to acquire guns and gunpowder through trade with North African merchants. The integration of firearms into the kingdom's military forces required new training methods and new tactical approaches, but it also provided new advantages in dealing with traditional enemies. The 16th century brought with it the first contacts with European powers, as Portuguese explorers and traders began to penetrate the interior of Africa. The Mais of Bornu were cautious in their dealings with these new arrivals, recognizing that they represented both opportunities and dangers. The Europeans brought with them new technologies and new goods, but they also brought diseases and ideas that could disrupt the established order. The correspondence between Mai Idris Aluma and the rulers of the Ottoman Empire represents one of the most fascinating chapters in Bornu's diplomatic history. The Mai had heard tales of the great Islamic empire that controlled much of the eastern Mediterranean, and he saw in the Ottomans potential allies against his enemies. The letters that passed between Zaghawa and Istanbul spoke of shared faith and common cause, but they also revealed the vast distances and cultural differences that separated the two realms. The military reforms instituted by Idris Aluma transformed Bornu into one of the most formidable powers in the Sudan. The Mai had studied the tactics and technologies of the Ottoman Empire, and he applied these lessons to the particular circumstances of his own kingdom. The introduction of Turkish military advisors and the adoption of Ottoman-style uniforms and weapons gave Bornu's armies a new professionalism and effectiveness. The construction of fortified camps, or ribats, at strategic points throughout the kingdom represented a new approach to defense. These installations, modeled on Ottoman military architecture, provided secure bases for the kingdom's armies and served as symbols of royal power. The ribats were not just military installations but centers of administration and trade, around which new communities grew up. The economic prosperity that Bornu enjoyed during the 16th century was based on a combination of factors. The kingdom's control over local trade routes, its development of agriculture and industry, and its diplomatic relations with other powers all contributed to a period of unprecedented wealth and stability. The markets of Zaghawa became centers of commerce that attracted merchants from across the Sudan and beyond. The cultural achievements of Bornu during this period reflected the kingdom's renewed confidence and prosperity. The court patronized poets and musicians who created works that celebrated the kingdom's recovery from the disasters of the previous century. The scholars of Zaghawa produced historical chronicles that preserved the memory of both Kanem and Bornu, ensuring that future generations would remember the achievements of their ancestors. The architectural monuments of Bornu, though less grandiose than those of the great Islamic empires, reflected the kingdom's particular character and circumstances. The mosques of Zaghawa were built in a style that combined Islamic architectural principles with local traditions, creating structures that were both beautiful and functional. The royal palaces, though simpler than those of Njimi, were designed to reflect the dignity and authority of the Mais who ruled from them. The educational institutions of Bornu continued the traditions of Islamic learning that had been established in Kanem. The madrasas of Zaghawa attracted students from across the Sudan, and their graduates went on to serve as judges, administrators, and teachers throughout the Islamic world. The libraries of these institutions preserved thousands of manuscripts, including works on law, theology, history, and literature that represented the intellectual heritage of the kingdom. The position of women in Bornu society was complex and varied, reflecting both Islamic principles and local traditions. The queens and royal wives played important roles in court life and often wielded considerable influence over political decisions. The Majira, or Queen Mother, was a figure of particular importance, serving as an advisor to the Mai and as a link between the ruling family and the broader community. The agricultural innovations that were introduced during this period helped to support the kingdom's growing population and to reduce its dependence on trade. New crops, including varieties of millet and sorghum that were better adapted to local conditions, were introduced from other parts of Africa. The development of irrigation systems in the areas around Zaghawa increased agricultural productivity and provided a more reliable food supply. The diplomatic relations that Bornu maintained with its neighbors were complex and constantly changing. The kingdom's position between the Sahara and the forest regions of the south made it a natural intermediary in trade and diplomacy. The Mais of Bornu skillfully played their various neighbors against each other, forming alliances when it served their interests and remaining neutral when involvement might prove dangerous. The religious tolerance that characterized Bornu was one of its greatest strengths. While Islam was the official religion and the faith of the ruling class, traditional beliefs and practices were not suppressed but were allowed to coexist with the new faith. This approach helped to maintain social harmony and to integrate the various ethnic groups that made up the kingdom's population. The merchants of Bornu were skilled negotiators who understood the complexities of international commerce. Their caravans carried goods from the forests of the south to the cities of the north, and their profits helped to fund the kingdom's military forces and public works. The commercial networks that they established connected Bornu to markets throughout Africa and the Middle East. The technological innovations that were adopted during this period helped to improve the kingdom's military effectiveness and economic productivity. The introduction of new weapons and military techniques, the development of new agricultural methods, and the adoption of new craft techniques all contributed to Bornu's continued prosperity and power. As the 16th century drew to a close, Bornu had successfully transformed itself from a kingdom in exile to a major power in the Sudan. The resilience and adaptability that had enabled it to survive the disasters of the previous century had been proved in the crucible of experience. The kingdom stood ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring, confident in its ability to adapt and survive. But time is the great leveler, and even the mightiest kingdoms must eventually bow before its relentless advance. The 17th century would bring new challenges that would test Bornu's strength in ways that its rulers could never have imagined. From the north came the expansion of the Ottoman Empire, whose governors in Tripoli and Cairo cast covetous eyes toward the wealth of the Sudan. From the west came the growing power of the Hausa city-states, whose armies were increasingly well-equipped and well-organized. From the east, the Bilala remained a constant threat, their raids continuing to disrupt trade and drain the kingdom's resources. The long reign of Mai Ibn Umar, who ruled for over 40 years during the 17th century, was marked by a gradual but inexorable decline in the kingdom's power and influence. The old trade routes that had been the lifeblood of Kanem and early Bornu were increasingly disrupted by warfare and banditry, while new routes developed by European merchants along the Atlantic coast began to drain away the commerce that had once flowed through the Chad Basin. The kingdom's armies, though still formidable, were no longer the irresistible force they had once been. The changes were subtle at first, like the gradual drying of a well or the slow fading of a once bright cloth. The caravans that arrived in Zaghawa grew smaller and less frequent, their loads lighter and their profits thinner. The markets that had once buzzed with activity from dawn to dusk began to show empty stalls and disappointed merchants. The royal treasury, which had once overflowed with the wealth of the trans-Saharan trade, began to feel the strain of maintaining the kingdom's vast military and administrative apparatus. The military challenges that faced Bornu during this period were more complex and demanding than those that had confronted earlier generations. The kingdom's enemies were no longer simple raiders or rival city-states but organized powers with their own resources and ambitions. The Tuareg confederations of the north had consolidated their control over key oases and trade routes, while the house estates of the west had developed sophisticated military and administrative systems that enabled them to compete effectively with Bornu. The introduction of European weapons and military techniques by various regional powers created new tactical challenges for Bornu's armies. The traditional heavy cavalry, which had dominated the battlefields of the Sudan for centuries, found itself increasingly vulnerable to disciplined infantry formations armed with firearms. The kingdom's military leaders struggled to adapt their tactics to these new realities, but the process of change was slow and often painful. The siege of Ngazargamu, which had replaced Zaghawa as the kingdom's capital, by a coalition of Tuareg and Arab forces in the late 17th century, demonstrated the changed nature of warfare in the region. The attackers employed European-style siege techniques, using cannons and other advanced weapons to breach the city's walls. Though the siege was ultimately unsuccessful, it revealed the vulnerability of even the strongest fortifications to modern weapons and tactics. The diplomatic landscape of the region had also changed dramatically. The old patterns of alliance and rivalry that had characterized relations between the Sudan kingdoms were disrupted by the growing influence of European powers and the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. The Mais of Bornu found themselves increasingly isolated, their traditional allies either conquered or co-opted by more powerful neighbors. The correspondence between the court of Bornu and the Ottoman governors of Tripoli reveals the desperate nature of the kingdom's situation. The Mais sought military assistance and protection from the Ottomans, offering tribute and acknowledgement of Ottoman suzerainty in exchange for support against their enemies. But the Ottomans, dealing with their own challenges in Europe and the Middle East, were reluctant to commit significant resources to the defense of distant African kingdoms. The economic foundations of Bornu were steadily eroded during this period. The kingdom's control over the trans-Saharan trade routes was gradually lost to more aggressive neighbors, while the development of Atlantic trade routes by European merchants reduced the importance of the traditional trans-Saharan commerce. The kingdom's agricultural base, though still significant, was insufficient to support the elaborate military and administrative apparatus that had been built up during the years of prosperity. The social structure of Bornu began to show signs of strain as the kingdom's resources became increasingly scarce. The traditional relationship between the ruling class and the common people, which had been based on mutual benefit and shared prosperity, began to break down as the rulers were forced to extract ever greater resources from their subjects to fund their military and administrative activities. The loyalty that had once bound the kingdom together began to fray at the edges. The cultural and intellectual life of Bornu, which had flourished during the kingdom's golden age, began to decline as resources became scarce and scholars and artists sought opportunities elsewhere. The great libraries of Ngazargamu, though still impressive, were no longer growing at the rate they once had, while the madrasas struggled to maintain their standards in the face of reduced funding and competition from institutions in other kingdoms. The religious life of the kingdom remained strong, but even here there were signs of change. The old synthesis of Islam and traditional beliefs that had characterized Bornu's religious culture was increasingly challenged by more orthodox Islamic movements that originated in the north. These reform movements, while bringing new energy to religious life, also created tensions and divisions within the kingdom's society. The 18th century brought with it new challenges that would further test the kingdom's resilience. The rise of the Fulani jihads in the western Sudan created new centers of Islamic power that challenged Bornu's traditional role as the leader of the faithful in the region. The Fulani reformers, led by charismatic leaders like Usman Dan Fodio, preached a message of religious renewal and social reform that attracted followers from across the Sudan. The impact of the Fulani jihads on Bornu was profound and lasting. The kingdom found itself increasingly isolated as its traditional allies were either conquered by the Fulani or chose to align themselves with the new movement. The Mais of Bornu, despite their long history of Islamic rule, were viewed with suspicion by the Fulani reformers, who saw them as corrupt and compromised rulers who had strayed from the true path of Islam. The military confrontations between Bornu and the Fulani forces were marked by a new intensity and ideological fervor. These were not simply wars of conquest or territorial expansion, but holy wars in which religious conviction played a central role. The Fulani warriors, motivated by their belief in the righteousness of their cause, fought with a fanaticism that often overcame the superior training and equipment of their opponents. The siege of Ngazargamu by Fulani forces in 1808 marked a turning point in the kingdom's history. The capital, which had withstood numerous attacks over the centuries, finally fell to the reformers, its walls breached and its palaces burned. The Mai and his court were forced to flee eastward, seeking refuge in the remote regions of the kingdom where they hoped to rebuild their power. The destruction of Ngazargamu was more than a military defeat. It was a symbolic end to an era. The city that had been the heart of Bornu for centuries was reduced to ruins, its libraries scattered and its treasures looted. The continuity of tradition that had been maintained for over 1,000 years was broken, and the kingdom's identity was forever altered. The establishment of a new capital at Zaghawa, near the site of the old Bornu capital, represented an attempt to rebuild the kingdom from its foundations. The new city, though smaller and less magnificent than Ngazargamu, was designed to be more defensible and more suited to the changed circumstances of the kingdom. The Mais who ruled from this new capital were forced to adopt new strategies and new approaches to governance. The military reforms that were implemented during this period reflected the harsh lessons learned from the kingdom's defeats. The traditional heavy cavalry, though still important, was supplemented by new formations of infantry armed with firearms and trained in European-style tactics. The kingdom's fortifications were redesigned to withstand artillery bombardment, while new emphasis was placed on mobility and guerrilla warfare. The economic recovery of Bornu during the early 19th century was slow and difficult. The kingdom's traditional sources of wealth had been disrupted or destroyed, and new sources of revenue had to be found. The Mais turned their attention to the development of local industries and agriculture, encouraging the cultivation of new crops and the establishment of craft workshops that could produce goods for both domestic consumption and export. The diplomatic relations that Bornu maintained during this period were characterized by a new realism and pragmatism. The kingdom's rulers recognized that they were no longer one of the great powers of the Sudan, and they adjusted their foreign policy accordingly. They sought to maintain their independence through careful diplomacy and strategic alliances, avoiding confrontations that they could not win. The cultural revival that began in the early 19th century was led by scholars and artists who were determined to preserve the kingdom's heritage despite the disasters of the previous century. New chronicles were written that recorded the kingdom's history and traditions, while artists created works that celebrated its achievements and mourned its losses. The libraries of Zaghawa, though smaller than those of Ngazargamu, began to grow once again as manuscripts were collected and copied. The religious life of the kingdom during this period was marked by a new orthodoxy and a rejection of the syncretic practices that had characterized earlier centuries. The influence of the Fulani reform movement, though hostile to Bornu politically, had a profound impact on the kingdom's religious culture. The Mais embraced a more orthodox form of Islam, hoping to legitimize their rule and counter the criticisms of their enemies. The social structure of Bornu began to change as the kingdom adapted to its reduced circumstances. The old aristocracy, which had been based on military service and administrative competence, was gradually replaced by a new elite that was more commercially oriented and more responsive to the kingdom's economic needs. The common people, though still bound by traditional ties of loyalty and obligation, began to enjoy greater freedom and opportunity as the old rigid hierarchies broke down. The technological innovations that were adopted during this period helped to improve the kingdom's military effectiveness and economic productivity. The introduction of new weapons and military techniques, the development of new agricultural methods, and the adoption of new craft techniques all contributed to Bornu's gradual recovery. The kingdom's ability to adapt and innovate, which had been its greatest strength throughout its history, once again proved crucial to its survival. The educational institutions of Bornu, though reduced in number and scope, continued to play an important role in preserving the kingdom's intellectual heritage. The madrasas of Zaghawa, while smaller than those of earlier centuries, maintained high standards of scholarship and continued to attract students from across the Sudan. The curriculum was gradually modernized to include new subjects and new approaches to learning. The position of women in Bornu society underwent significant changes during this period. The economic pressures that faced the kingdom created new opportunities for women to participate in trade and craft production, while the social disruptions of the previous century had weakened some of the traditional restrictions on women's activities. The queens and royal wives continued to play important roles in court life, but their influence was now more limited than it had been in earlier centuries. The agricultural innovations that were introduced during this period helped to support the kingdom's recovery and to reduce its dependence on trade. New crops, including varieties that were better adapted to the changing climate of the region, were introduced and cultivated. The development of new irrigation systems and agricultural techniques increased productivity and provided a more reliable food supply for the kingdom's population. As the 19th century progressed, Bornu faced new challenges that would test its resilience once again. The growth of European influence in West Africa, the expansion of the Atlantic slave trade, and the increasing sophistication of neighboring powers all created new pressures that the kingdom would have to address. But the lessons learned from previous crises had taught the Mais and their people that survival required adaptability, that strength came not from rigid adherence to tradition but from the ability to change and evolve while maintaining essential identity and values. The final century of Bornu's independent existence would be marked by both triumph and tragedy, by moments of renewed glory and periods of desperate struggle. The kingdom that had once dominated the Chad Basin would face its greatest test, not from traditional enemies or familiar challenges, but from forces that would ultimately reshape the entire continent of Africa. The story of these final decades is one of courage and determination, of a people who refused to surrender their identity even when faced with overwhelming odds. The reign of Muhammad al-Kanemi, who came to power in the early 19th century, marked the beginning of what would be the kingdom's last great revival. Al-Kanemi was not of the traditional royal bloodline but was a scholar and warrior who had risen to prominence through his learning and his military skill. His accession to power represented a break with the past, but it also demonstrated the kingdom's ability to adapt its institutions to meet new challenges. Al-Kanemi's first priority was the restoration of the kingdom's military strength. The defeats of the previous century had shown that Bornu's traditional military organization was no longer adequate to deal with the challenges of the modern world. The new Mai embarked on a comprehensive program of military reform that would transform the kingdom's armed forces from a medieval cavalry army into a more modern fighting force capable of holding its own against contemporary enemies. The introduction of European military advisors and the adoption of European-style training methods were central to these reforms. The kingdom's traditional heavy cavalry was retained but was supplemented by new formations of infantry armed with modern firearms and trained in European tactics. Artillery units were established, and the kingdom's fortifications were redesigned to withstand bombardment by modern weapons. The recruitment of soldiers from outside the traditional warrior class was another important innovation. Al-Kanemi understood that the kingdom's survival depended on its ability to mobilize all of its human resources, and he began to recruit soldiers from among the common people, offering them training, equipment, and the promise of advancement based on merit rather than birth. This democratization of the military had profound implications for the kingdom's social structure. The economic policies implemented by Al-Kanemi were designed to restore the kingdom's prosperity and to reduce its dependence on the increasingly unreliable trans-Saharan trade. The Mai encouraged the development of local industries, particularly the production of textiles and metalwork, which could provide both employment for the kingdom's people and goods for export. He also promoted the cultivation of new crops and the improvement of agricultural techniques. The establishment of closer relations with European merchants and explorers was another key element of Al-Kanemi's strategy. The Mai understood that the world was changing, that the old patterns of trade and diplomacy were being replaced by new ones dominated by European powers. He sought to position Bornu as a valuable partner for European interests while maintaining the kingdom's independence and Islamic identity. The diplomatic correspondence between Al-Kanemi and European officials reveals a ruler who was both pragmatic and principled. He was willing to cooperate with European powers when it served his kingdom's interests, but he was also determined to maintain Bornu's sovereignty and to resist any attempts at European domination. His letters demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of international relations and a clear vision of his kingdom's place in the changing world order. The cultural renaissance that occurred during Al-Kanemi's reign was remarkable for its breadth and sophistication. The Mai was himself a scholar and poet, and he attracted to his court intellectuals and artists from across the Islamic world. The libraries of Zaghawa were expanded and enriched, while new madrasas were established to provide education for the kingdom's youth. The court became a center of learning and culture that rivaled the great Islamic centers of the past. The architectural achievements of this period, though modest by the standards of earlier centuries, demonstrated the kingdom's renewed confidence and prosperity. The royal palace at Zaghawa was rebuilt and expanded, while new mosques and public buildings were constructed throughout the kingdom. These structures, while incorporating traditional Islamic architectural elements, also showed the influence of new ideas and techniques learned from contact with the outside world. The religious policies of Al-Kanemi reflected his understanding of the importance of maintaining Islamic unity while accommodating the diverse beliefs and practices of his subjects. The Mai was a devout Muslim who supported orthodox Islamic practices, but he also recognized the need for tolerance and flexibility in dealing with the kingdom's diverse population. His approach to religious matters helped to maintain social harmony while strengthening the kingdom's Islamic identity. The legal reforms implemented during this period were designed to create a more efficient and equitable system of justice. The traditional Islamic legal system was maintained, but it was supplemented by new courts and new procedures that could handle the increasing complexity of legal matters in a modernizing society. The training of judges and legal officials was improved, and new legal codes were developed to address contemporary issues. The military campaigns of Al-Kanemi's reign demonstrated the effectiveness of his reforms. The kingdom's armies, equipped with modern weapons and trained in contemporary tactics, were able to defeat traditional enemies and to expand the kingdom's territory. The conquest of several neighboring regions not only increased Bornu's power but also provided new sources of revenue and manpower. The victory over the Bulala, the ancient enemies who had driven the kingdom from its original homeland, was particularly significant. The campaign that resulted in the recovery of the old Kanem territories was carefully planned and brilliantly executed, demonstrating the transformation of Bornu's military capabilities. The psychological impact of this victory was enormous, restoring the kingdom's confidence and prestige. The exploration and mapping of the kingdom's territories during this period revealed the extent of Bornu's natural resources and strategic advantages. European explorers and geographers, working under the Mai's protection, produced detailed maps and descriptions of the kingdom that helped to attract international interest and investment. These explorations also provided the kingdom's rulers with better information about their own territories and resources. The development of new trade routes and commercial relationships was another important achievement of this period. While the traditional trans-Saharan trade remained important, new routes were developed that connected Bornu to the Atlantic coast and to the growing commercial centers of West Africa. These new commercial relationships provided alternative sources of revenue and reduced the kingdom's dependence on traditional trade partners. The social changes that occurred during Al-Kanemi's reign were profound and lasting. The traditional aristocracy, based on birth and military service, was gradually replaced by a new elite that included merchants, scholars, and military officers who had risen through merit rather than heredity. This social transformation, while sometimes controversial, helped to revitalize the kingdom's institutions and to create new sources of energy and innovation. The position of women in Bornu society continued to evolve during this period. The economic opportunities created by the kingdom's commercial expansion provided new roles for women in trade and craft production, while the social changes of the era weakened some of the traditional restrictions on women's activities. The queens and royal women continued to play important roles in court life and politics, but their influence was now exercised in different ways. The educational innovations of this period were designed to prepare the kingdom's youth for the challenges of the modern world. The traditional Islamic curriculum was maintained, but it was supplemented by new subjects including European languages, mathematics, and natural sciences. The goal was to create a generation of leaders who could navigate the complexities of an increasingly interconnected world while maintaining their Islamic and African identity. The death of Al-Kanemi in 1837 marked the end of an era, but the foundations he had laid proved durable. His successor, Mai Umar, continued many of his policies while facing new challenges that would test the kingdom's resilience once again. The pressure from European powers was increasing, while new technological and military developments were changing the nature of warfare and international relations. The arrival of European explorers and missionaries in increasing numbers during the middle of the 19th century brought new opportunities and new dangers. These visitors brought with them knowledge of the outside world and access to new technologies. But they also brought diseases, ideas, and political pressures that could destabilize the kingdom. The Mais of Bornu had to carefully balance the benefits of European contact with the risks it posed to their independence and traditional way of life. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, which partitioned Africa among the European powers, marked the beginning of the end for Bornu's independence. The kingdom found itself divided between German, French, and British spheres of influence, its territory carved up by powers that had little understanding of its history or culture. The Mais protested these decisions, but they lacked the military and political power to resist effectively. The establishment of colonial administrations in the territories that had once been part of Bornu was accomplished gradually and with varying degrees of resistance. The traditional rulers were sometimes retained as puppet figures, while real power was exercised by European colonial officials. The ancient institutions of the kingdom were either abolished or transformed beyond recognition, while new laws and administrative systems were imposed from outside. The resistance to colonial rule was often led by traditional leaders who sought to preserve their authority and their people's way of life. These resistance movements, while ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated the continued vitality of Bornu's political and cultural traditions. The fighters who took up arms against the colonial powers were motivated not just by political considerations but by a deep attachment to their homeland and their heritage. The economic transformation that accompanied colonial rule was dramatic and often devastating. The traditional economy, based on agriculture, livestock, and long-distance trade, was replaced by a colonial economy designed to serve European interests. Cash crops were introduced, while traditional crafts and industries were discouraged or destroyed. The social and cultural impact of these changes was profound and lasting. The educational policies of the colonial powers were designed to create a new generation of Africans who would be loyal to European rule and useful to the colonial administration. The traditional Islamic schools were often closed or marginalized, while new schools were established that taught European languages and values. The goal was to transform African societies from within, to create elites that would serve colonial interests. The religious policies of the colonial powers varied depending on the particular colony and the colonial power involved. In some areas, Christian missions were actively promoted, while in others, traditional Islamic practices were tolerated or even encouraged. The goal was always to maintain control and to prevent the emergence of religious movements that might challenge colonial authority. The cultural impact of colonial rule was perhaps the most devastating of all. The traditional oral traditions, the ancient customs, and the social institutions that had sustained Bornu for over 1,000 years were systematically undermined or destroyed. The young people were encouraged to abandon their heritage in favor of European ways, while the old knowledge and wisdom were dismissed as primitive and irrelevant. The final collapse of Bornu's independence came not through dramatic military defeat, but through the gradual erosion of its institutions and the co-optation of its leaders. The last Mais found themselves reduced to ceremonial figures, their authority limited to minor administrative functions under the supervision of colonial officials. The kingdom that had once dominated the Chad Basin was transformed into a collection of administrative districts governed by foreign bureaucrats. The death of the last independent Mai in 1893 marked the end of more than 1,000 years of continuous rule by the Sayfawa dynasty. The kingdom that had been founded in the mists of history, that had survived invasions and internal conflicts, that had adapted to changing circumstances and overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges, finally succumbed to forces that were beyond its power to resist. But even in defeat, the spirit of Bornu endured. The people who had been shaped by centuries of Islamic rule and African tradition did not simply disappear. They adapted once again, finding new ways to preserve their identity and their values under colonial rule. The traditional knowledge, the ancient stories, and the cultural practices that had sustained them through so many trials were passed down to new generations, often in secret, always with the hope that they would someday be free to express their heritage openly once again. The legacy of Kanem-Bornu extends far beyond its political history. The kingdom's achievements in military organization, administrative efficiency, and cultural synthesis provided models that influenced the development of other African states. Its scholars and intellectuals made important contributions to Islamic learning and African historiography. Its merchants and traders helped to create the commercial networks that connected Africa to the wider world. Today, as I sit by this dying fire and listen to the wind across the waters of Lake Chad, I can still hear the echoes of our ancestors' voices. The kingdoms they built may have fallen. The cities they raised may lie in ruins, but the spirit that animated them lives on. In the stories we tell, in the prayers we offer, in the hopes we carry for the future, the legacy of Kanem-Bornu endures. We were the horsemen of the desert, the guardians of the lake, the children of both the Sahara and the Sudan. We rode with the wind and prayed with the dawn, and though our kingdoms have passed into history, our heritage remains eternal, written not in stone but in the hearts of those who remember.